The Supreme Court has ruled that Maine violated the Constitution when it refused to make public funding available for students to attend schools that provide religious instruction. The opinion given by Chief Justice Roberts provided a clear sentiment that when state and local governments choose to subsidize private schools, they must allow families to use taxpayer funds to pay for religious schools.
Justice Sonia Sotomayor came out against the ruling, accusing conservatives on the court of attempting to end the separation between church and state. She wrote in her dissent, "In just a few years, the court has upended constitutional doctrine, shifting from a rule that permits states to decline to fund religious organizations to one that requires states, in many circumstances, to subsidize religious indoctrination with taxpayer dollars."
Twitter user Lawboy writes, "This case is even worse than it looks. In response to desegregation, conservatives began to build a network of private religious schools absorbing public funds, but not subject to the rules governing public education. This is part of that effort." Robby,
I suspect we're going to disagree massively on this
one. Yeah, so what's your issue here? Why do you not have these establishment clause concerns?
No, I think that it is perfectly fine to fund religious education, that the education dollars should, as a matter of policy, constitutional question.
But that's not what the case says. The state actually is able to and has been funding religious education. The rule was that Maine was funding these schools, but and they may be affiliated with or even run by religious organizations, but their actual curricula just had to align with state standards. Two families challenged that limitation, and before recently, that claim would have been, this is according to an article in Slate, would have been laughed out of court because SCOTUS only permitted states to subsidize religious schools beginning in 2002. Now it's saying that if the state says it wants to have any standards, this is from a libertarian, the state has now said that it wants to have standards about what kind of curriculum is happening in these religiously funded schools, and that's what was at issue in this case.
Right, it can't do that.
Right, so you don't think that the federal government sending federal dollars to kids, to
sending
parents
your
who want to,
your dollars,
who parents who want to, because they're in these rural parts of Maine, completely understandable, have access to schools that aren't necessarily the public schools that don't provide sufficient support to their community, should at least adhere to the same kind of federal standards that happen that are promulgated.
They have to be accredited. They have to be legitimate schools.
Well, no, the argument here is that they should have to give a secular education and not a purely religious education. That's the standard, that the government shouldn't be paying for kids to get a religious education. How is that
It's paying for them to get whatever education their families, the kids, think is in their best interest.
Well, the argument...
We are publicly funding education, but we don't need to have education provided by the government. We can let a million flowers bloom. No, it's funded by the government. It's funded by you and by your tax dollars.
Robby, should the government fund a public school devoted to drag performances and which educates kids exclusively on CRT and hormone replacement therapy, gender affirming therapy?
I think the family should get the money and can use that money toward their child's education for whatever education they think is best. And if some liberal family thinks that education is best and that school meets accreditation standards, that is perfectly fine.
So when the Church of Satan drag school opens in rural Maine or whatever fear-mongering...
Liberals don't understand what we actually think. Your terms are acceptable. Yes, absolutely, fine.
No, your terms, Robby, perhaps because you're a libertarian, are willing to take this line, but you know very well that this is a context-dependent outcome, and that the whole problem with these establishment law cases is that they have to pick and choose which religions and which beliefs are legitimate and which aren't. That's
why separating religion from all other kinds of belief doesn't make any sense.
That is exactly the scenario the founding fathers intended to avoid. You should not be establishing one religion over the other, and because you cannot get in this game,
they're not establishing. This is not establishing one over the other. They're saying if it's religion, doesn't matter.
It's saying the state can't make a choice to decide what kinds of institutions, to set any standard for what institutions get funded by federal tax dollars.
Right.
And I think that in any other context, people would believe that there has to be some basic educational standard that's in place.
There has to be a basic educational standard because it has to meet school accreditation.
But it doesn't.
It can't not be a school.
It doesn't.
It can't not be a school in order to...
These schools are no longer required to give a secular education. That means the school can sit there and
teach not the same as
that dinosaurs lived at the same time as man, and that, Jesus, whatever
Right, they can
religious
teach that
tradition
God
you
is
have,
the-
whether you're Muslim,
It could be Muslim,
or Jewish,
it could be Jewish,
or
it could
Hindu,
be- yeah.
or what have you, or the
Yeah.
Church of the Spaghetti Monster.
Yeah, that's
the school
fine.
can say, well, the Spaghetti Monster people, the Church of Satan. This is what we believe, and we're
I
going
have
to
no fear of the Church of Satan.
We're going to give instruction in this kind of thing. And
Right.
regardless if there's math or discipline, you have conservatives all over the country upset because math is somehow being CRT'd and math is
Right.
racist and all of that. Fine. I grant
They're
you.
upset because there's no alternative. There's upset because
No.
you
That's
liberals
not
have
why
said
they're
this is
upset.
universally what the only curriculum can be and should be.
That's not at all what's happening, Robby.
I'm saying we can
That's not
de-escalate
what's
this battle.
happening.
Instead of having this intense culture war over what all schools are forced to teach, we can de-escalate by saying, you know what? You and your family can choose the
Right.
school that
And
aligns with you,
no,
and that's great. And you and your family
that
can do
free
that.
choice is
We don't need
fine.
to battle each other anymore. We don't need to decide this.
Robby, as a libertarian, that choice is fine, but you cannot then say, I'm a libertarian, I want people independently to make their own kind of choices and go to whatever school they want. And then say, also though, I'm going to co-opt federal tax dollars to support schools without any kind of basic secular educational standard, explicitly by saying that they can promulgate a religious and exclusively religious without a secular standard for education. They are saying tax dollars are establishing religious doctrine in an educational context. I don't understand. Look, I have no problem.
That's fine.
If Maine wants, Maine here, let's really be clear about what's happening. Maine fully did and has been doing funding for religious institutions, religious schools. That's not the issue. This isn't big bad liberals saying, oh my gosh, I don't want Catholic schools or whatever to be funded. The government has been doing that, and Maine has been doing that. The question is whether or not they should have to provide a basic secular education standard if they are going to take federal funds. I have a hard time understanding why that's objectionable.
You mean they should be able to take the fund. It's our money. It's letting the people take the money that comes from their taxes that the government confiscates to provide an education, and saying they can use that to get the educational environment that best fits their needs. And if that's a religious environment, what do you mean like secular standards? Like they still teach, they have to meet the accreditation standards to be a school. You can't just you can't send your kids to a school that doesn't meet accreditation standards, period.
I don't know what that means. All I know is that apparently these parents were so upset by
if you want to homeschool your kids, you have to meet certain requirements even.
These parents were so upset, the people who brought this case were so upset about whatever these basic secular education standards are, that they took this case to the Supreme Court. So that's what's at issue here. This is not, and from a federalism perspective, from a states' rights perspective, it is very curious to me that conservatives wouldn't question why you have a conservative state, that has decided.
They're saying you can't discriminate against religious belief.
No.
That's what they're saying. It's
Before
discriminatory.
2002, states weren't even permitted to fund religious institutions.
Right.
Now the pendulum has swung and said, okay, you can do it because
I hope it keeps swinging.
There's a basic acknowledgement that the public education system isn't sufficiently serving kids in this country. Fair enough. I would argue that as for a host of reasons, including, as we mentioned in the read at the top, that a lot of money was pulled out of the public education system during white flight. When desegregation happened, schools were integrated, and so many white families decided that they were going to take their tax dollars and run rather than have their kids go to school with Black kids. I mean, that's just the history of how we got this massive private education system that didn't used to exist before. Americans used to realize that we really valued, and we're very proud of our public education system before everyone was equally served by it.
If the public education system is meeting families' needs, they can go that route. If it's not, they should be able to. Where your zip code should not determine what school you have to go to. You should just get that money and do what's best for you and in consultation with your family.
So, school, again, it is, Maine has been, and you are permitted to subsidize, the state subsidizes religious institutions, right? But this is a radical theory to a new extreme. Ordering Maine. No, this case is about ordering Maine. Not that Maine has the choice to fund religious institutions. This is a federalism issue.
They're saying it violates, it's discriminatory against religion for them to not set aside funds for this kind of school environment.
I'm very interested
That's
to
what
see.
they're saying.
I personally am a subscriber to the Church of the Spaghetti Monster.
So what if Maine had said you can use this money on any school but not a Muslim school? Mm-hmm. Now they can't because of the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court decision is saying, no, you can't discriminate against religious belief. Which I applaud. You should absolutely be able to take the public money and get a
Robby,
Muslim.
As I'm reading this, the issue is that if the Muslim school has a secular education opportunity, like many Catholic schools do, and like many of these schools do, then it's not an issue. You cannot withhold.
Say that again.
You cannot withhold.
What do you mean a secular education opportunity?
Carson
if you
challenges
go to
Maine's
a
effort to
religious
provide
school,
quality
you're
civic
going
education to every child in the state. The government created a tuition assistance program to help families who live in remote, sparsely populated regions without any public schools. Under the program, parents can send their kids to certain private schools, and the state covers the cost of tuition.
Right.
To qualify, these schools must give students a secular education. They may be affiliated with or even run by a religious organization, but their actual curriculum must ally with secular state
They
standards.
all get a secular education. I mean, the math does not have a religious
Evidently
component,
not, Robby.
right?
Evidently not. And that's what's at issue here. So you cannot discriminate against a school because it's a Christian school or a Muslim school or a Jewish school. But you can discriminate against them based on their not rising to the basic curriculum responsibilities.
And I think you shouldn't be able to do that, and the Supreme Court agrees with me. So there was a Muslim school advocacy group that was part of the people filing suit here because they wanted to not.
My grandfather was Muslim. I'm certainly not. This isn't about me picking and choosing religions. My whole point is that the state shouldn't be in the business of having to decide one day that doesn't want to fund the Spaghetti Monsters pole dancing class for kids, which I know that many conservatives and many liberals would have an issue
See, I don't
with.
have this battle anymore. That's fine. That you do you, your family do you, and that should be the way it goes. And we don't have to have these intense wars over it at the atomic national level if we can just let people be different. It's fine.
And I think the Constitution and the Founding Fathers.
Now who's the strict constitutionalist?
It's not about
Didn't
being
you just
a
say
strict
the Constitution just gets in our way of doing whatever policy we think should be best?
No, I think that you should
let's
decide.
do it. This policy's better.
You should look at what society is and what core values you have as a community. And I think one of our core values as a community is that the government should not be in the business of deciding which religions are real and which aren't, which is obviously what always has to happen when you're talking about tax breaks.
Well, this gets us out of that business. There's no difference between religious practice or any
Robby,
other
when you're
practice,
talking
and
about-
so you just have to, as long as it's a school.
When you're talking about tax breaks for religious institutions or any other context where the government is deciding who qualifies for financial benefit on the basis of being a religion. But
all right. Well, I knew we were going to disagree on this one, so it's nice to get a real debate on it. So tomorrow on Rising, maybe we'll talk about this more. I think we could have gone on for a while. But also Stephen Semler will join us to break down a new bill that could drain as much as $100 billion from the Department of Defense's budget. Licking my lips.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who'd like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Have a good one, and we will see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.